Hello, my name is Hanson Oak, and I'd like to tell you my story. Our mind is an incredible thing. Understanding how it works, the secret language of the synapse, the mystery of how a few pounds of protein can become, well, us, is something we're only starting to unlock. A wonderfully mysterious process in which science has yet to wrap its head around, pun intended, is the mystery of self, of thought. When we think internally, we do not hear anything, but we understand it all the same. There was a time before screens dominated our view and stole our attention that we once looked around the world and just thought. We would sit and think and consider and form opinions completely on the merit of our own minds without the influence of influencers. This led to the modern world, of course, through advances of science and math and imagination. But if we boil it down, our thoughts are just our mind making sense of the world by itself, and we're just bystanders. We can no more will our minds to stop from thinking as we can our hearts from beating, but how do we know whose thoughts they are? I confess they're not always our own. My train arrived in Fredericksburg, Virginia just after midnight. I was the lone passenger on the train and received by the lone soul on the station platform, Thomas Smith. He approached me with an eager hand outstretched, a firm shake, and then a hug. I felt his body wilt a bit like a flower just picked, not dead, no longer alive, but strong enough to stay upright. Still, he was fading. Thomas took my bag and ushered me through a mild fog that had set into his truck. When we got in, he pulled the shifter hard and the truck lurched over a curb. I bounced around the cabin, clutching the seatbelt that I didn't have time to fasten yet. "He's always had migraines, Mr. Oak," Thomas said, "but it's nothing that a day in a quiet, dark room can't chase off. This is different." He explained that 2 months prior, his husband Philip's headaches had began. At first the symptoms were common, sensitivity to light, sound, bouts with nausea, and so on, but then things began to change. Philip began talking in his sleep. Not unusual for anyone, but unusual for him. It was the gaps when he would talk that bothered me, Thomas explained. He would be saying something, then pause like he was waiting for someone else to finish talking before he started again. They'd gone to the doctor, had an MRI done and other tests, all inconclusive. All signs pointed to a psychological disorder, and therapy began but quickly terminated as Philip refused to talk. It wasn't until one morning when Thomas was walking down the hall and he heard something that rose the hair on the back of his neck and drove him to immediately pen me a letter, asking for my assistance. He heard Philip talking to himself once again, but this time he heard the other side of the conversation. Philip was begging for something to go away, pleading for the end to the suffering. Thomas thought it was just him talking to the pain, nothing more than a sick man assigning a bit of personification to the intangible sickness that ailed him, but then as he turned and walked away, he heard something say, "No." Then Philip asked why it had to be him that was tormented, and the voice replied, "Why did you choose this home? Because it feels right. You're my home now. You are my home now." Philip began to weep, and Thomas entered the room to console his husband, but Philip insisted that he was not speaking to anyone and hadn't heard anything either. "I've always had a bit of clairvoyance, Mr. Oak," he told me, so I knew calling a doctor again would just be a waste of time. We pulled up to the house, an old estate home surrounded by rolling fields and lush woodlands, not a neighbor in sight. An old woman sat on the stairs of the porch. She did not seem to notice that we arrived, just stared off to the horizon as we parked and Thomas took my bags from the trunk. At his insistence, Southern hospitality has few rivals, and only when we approached did she turn her head and look at me. "I know who you are," she said. "I've been praying for you to come." I couldn't tell at that point if Thomas had also seen this woman or if this was just another lonely specter who'd taken to my arrival. Inside, the house was stale. No air moved, not a sound strayed. Thomas, ever the host, offered me food and drink as a soft landing to a hard journey, but I kindly dismissed it and wanted to see Philip right away. I was led up the staff staircase that took off from the back of the kitchen through narrow walls that exited through a secret panel on the second floor. Down the wide hall of meandering wainscoting, we came to a room sealed by double doors. Thomas knocked kindly, gently, but this was met by something slamming on the other side of the door that shook the hall like a wrecking ball answering a woodpecker. Thomas flashed an apologetic smile and leaned closer to the door and announced me, told Philip I'd come to see him, to help. There was no answer, but I can distinctly hear whispering. I quickly opened the door and entered, finding a startled Philip sitting in a wingback chair by the window. His face was pale, eyes sunken, his beard stretched to a few weeks' growth. He turned away, shooing me off with his hand, saying he had no need for visitors, but his voice held all the resolve of a colander trying to hold water. As I approached, I introduced myself, keeping a keen focus on his eyes, noticing that while the left held a keen focus on me in return, the right held for only a moment before softening, wandering off as if immediately bored or uncomfortable with my presence. An odd thing to see, one eye having a mind of its own. I took a small pen light from my coat pocket and asked if he wouldn't mind my examining him for a moment. To this, rightly, he pointed out that I was no doctor and asked what I expected to find. I told him that I was just curious how sensitive he was to light, suggesting that if he'd rightly gone through all the paths of modern medicine, then perhaps he wouldn't mind me stepping into the primitive realm of ancient answers. Migraines are very real and very painful. They're a debilitating condition of which my wife occasionally suffers and I am mercifully left out of. I explained this to him, and that while symptoms of a migraine may present, it's not always what it seems. Migraines, for instance, are temporary, mercifully, and most importantly, do not interfere with one's own mind by offering suggestions, making demands, or causing blindness. That is what a parasite cultivatil, or demon of the mind, does. It is a parasite that lives behind the eye, feeding on the optic nerve and using it to communicate with the hosts. It is a disgusting, painfully evolved creature that finds hosts by chance, laying its eggs in the breeze in hopes that they float along until they find a home. He scoffed at the notion that his thoughts were not his own, or that there was a creature living inside him making suggestions, and said all the tales of my curious madness had just been proven true, to which I said that he shouldn't mind a quick inspection. While his body language and facial expression clearly showed his annoyance with my request, his right eye had wandered back into the conversation and was now deathly focused on the flashlight in my hand. The moment I clicked on the light, Philip jumped from his chair and raced to the door. I yelled for Thomas to close it to keep Philip from running out, and he did so. Philip turned back to me frightened, a cornered animal thinking a predator was about to pounce, feeling that Philip was not feeling himself, but the symbiotic reaction of his parasite. "I'm not going to lie to you, Philip. What I have to do is going to hurt," I said. "There will be terrible discomfort during and after. I will also admit up front that I've had very little luck with saving the sight and even the eye, but I have been practicing." Honesty is a tricky thing, and timing of it even more so. In hindsight, I should have kept at least the last bit of my confession to myself, but it was in the room now like a poison gas, and we all just had to deal with it. I reached into my coat, removing my tool case. I placed it on the table and opened it, not trying to hide my instruments from them. The process itself is pretty straightforward, one of my own design refined through only a few dozen procedures. First, the victim unfortunate enough to be suffering this terrible affliction is held down, or in case of Philip, tied to the very sturdy oak bedpost by Thomas, myself, and 3 caretakers we had to call to assist us. Next, the head is made static, the eyes held open, and I excuse myself to go vomit once or twice in order to alleviate excess nerves. If anyone else present knew what was to come, there might have been a line for the bathroom. Upon my return, I put on my gloves and a visor. Next, I assemble my catch. It isn't fancy, but it has good success rate. First, we have the extension hooks, which is fed through the containment vessel, which is placed against the eye. This is usually where the screaming begins, both my own, the victim, and anyone else in the room. The creature is panicking, so the host follows suit, and there isn't much time. If the creature decides it's going to run to burrow into the brain, the host will be lost. The key is to line the hooks up with the iris, center is best, as that's where their parasite is watching this all unfold. I then tell them I'm going to count to 5, knowing full well I'll make the grab at 3, but the element of surprise is the most important tool I have. So I count. 1, 2, 3. Damn it. This does happen sometimes, and I warn them, but thankfully, this time went differently. Again, I counted. 1, 2, 3. Philip screams out, the pain of the procedure and the nerves in his head coming back to life no longer interrupted by the creature that inhabited it. I'm still allowing his husband to comfort him, to calm him, to reconnect with the man who was almost taken away from him. They then look to me, Philip with his one good eye, and I hold up the bottle for them to see the source of the problem. The parasite is blind, rageful, clawing and biting at the walls of its new prison, desperate for another host. The bottle is then burned, the parasite is perished, and in time Philip's sight may come back. But in the meantime, while he's healing, at least he knows his thoughts are his own.